Okay, in this Chapter 8 Lecture B video, we're going to pick up with the synovial joints. So the synovial joints are a little bit different because they do have that joint cavity. So they're a little bit more complex, so we have to look at the structural elements of that cavity. So the cavity, also called a synovial cavity, those two terms mean the same thing, is the space between your bones, okay, the articulating bones. It also has an articular capsule, which is a double-layered structure. The capsule sort of separates this joint from the rest of the body. The capsule has two layers. It has an outer fibrous layer that keeps the bones from being pulled apart. It also, again, isolates this joint from the rest of the body. And then there's an inner layer, which is also called the synovial membrane, and it lines the entire inner surface except where you have the hyaline cartilage present. And the cells in that membrane are going to secrete synovial fluid, which we'll talk about in just a minute. This is another example of that structure function core principle. The inner layer provides the joint with the means of obtaining life-sustaining substances. It also eliminates waste products because, again, we're kind of isolating this area off from the rest of the body, so there has to be some means of nourishing the cells that are making up the membranes in this particular area so they can get the oxygen, the blood supply, and the nutrients that they need. We also have to have a way of getting rid of those waste products that accumulate. So with the synovial fluid, it is very thick, and it has the following three functions. This is the functions for the synovial fluid. It provides lubrication, so it's going to reduce friction between the surfaces of the joint as the bones move. It's going to serve a metabolic function, which means it's going to provide a means for transportation of nutrients in and waste products out because there are no blood vessels within this joint. And then it also provides for shock absorption. It's going to help to kind of evenly distribute the stress and the force that's placed on these surfaces during these movements. Okay, the articular cartilage is a thin layer of hyaline cartilage, and it covers all of the exposed bones in that joint. Okay, and again, it provides a smooth surface for those bones to interact. It reduces wear and tear, and it helps reduce the friction. Okay, it is avascular because it's isolated within this capsule, so it relies very heavily on the synovial fluid for oxygen, for nutrients, and also for waste removal. Okay, there are a couple of other components in the synovial joint. There's a little bit of fat, adipose tissue. There, of course, there are nerves, and there are some blood vessels to try and help get the blood to where it needs to be. Alright, so let's look at the picture here. This is your knee joint. So right here we have the femur. Down here we have the tibia. This whole thing surrounding this wide, is the articular capsule. Okay, the blue line here is the articular cartilage. You can see where my mouse is tracing. Those are the surfaces of the bones that are involved in this joint. You, of course, have the joint space. This is kind of the darker blue, and that's filled with synovial fluid. And then you have the two layers of the capsule. You have the fibrous outer layer, and then you have the inner synovial membrane. Okay, so those are the main structural elements of a typical synovial joint. Now, it allows for more mobility. Okay, so there's a lot more movement in this joint compared to our other two types. However, they're less stable, okay, because of all that movement. So we do have some structures that are going to help provide some additional stabilization. The first one's a ligament. You guys are familiar with that. This is dense, regular collagenous tissue. It links one bone to another, and it gives some strength and reinforcement to the joint. So ligaments are going to connect bone to bone. The other one is a tendon. Okay, now a tendon is a component of skeletal muscle. It also is made of dense, regular collagenous tissue, and it's going to connect muscle to bone. Okay, so ligaments, bone to bone, tendons, muscle to bone. Now the tendons are going to cross the joints, and they also provide stabilization when the muscles are contracted. Muscle tone, which you know or you will learn in Unit 3, is a continuous level of muscle contraction, and it's good to have a certain amount of muscle tone. This provides a really good stabilizing force, and it makes for a healthier joint. We also have bursa and tendon sheaths. They also provide some stabilization in high stress regions. Bursa is a synovial fluid filled structure. It helps minimize friction between all the moving parts in this joint. The tendon sheath is a long bursa that surrounds the tendon, and it protects the tendon as they slide across the joint during movement. So these are both protection and stabilization features. So here's another common synovial joint. This is the shoulder joint. And you can see right here we have the articular cartilage. There's your joint cavity. You can see the synovial membrane right down here, the outer capsule, articular capsule there. You can see, of course, this is the humerus. Now this right here is the tendon sheath. All right, so this is that protective sheath that's going to cover up the tendon that's running across this joint. Here is your bursa. Okay, there's one of those bursa. It's, again, the fluid, synovial fluid filled structure that helps ease the movement and reduce some of that friction, help stabilize this joint. Okay, so we have some classes of synovial joints, and the bones in the joints move in different planes around an axis. And so these are the different possible configurations that can be present in the body. The first one are called non-axial joints. They allow motion to occur in one or more planes, but they're not moving around an axis. Okay, so those are non-axial. Then you have uniaxial, and these allow motion only around one axis. Then you have biaxial. They allow motion around two axes. And then you have multiaxial or triaxial joints, and they allow motion in all three axes. So I want to show you some examples that will help better explain this. So the first one is an elbow joint. Okay, and this again is one of your concept boosts. Try to understand the axis of motion and what that means. The elbow joint only has one axis, and it's shown in the figure here. It acts like a hinge. You probably heard the elbow is a hinge joint. It allows motion in one plane, which is perpendicular to the axis. So the forearm and the hand can move upward towards the shoulder, or they can make the opposite movement away from the shoulder. All right, but that's the only plane that they're going to be able to move in. Okay, so it's a uniaxial joint, one plane. The metacarpal phalangeal joints are biaxial. This is between the proximal phalanges and your metacarpals. So they are going to be able to move in two different axes. So axis 1, they can move, this allows the phalanges to move toward and away from the palm of the hand, kind of like the elbow joint. So like if you take your fingers and bend them toward your palm, or if you straighten them back out. All right, that's the metacarpal phalangeal joint. That's axis 1. Axis 2 is when you allow your fingers to be squeezed together or fanned out. Okay, so that one joint where your fingers connect to your metacarpals, which is your palm, they can go in two directions. All right, up and down, toward and away, or they can go out and in. They can be squeezed out or they can be brought back in. Okay, the third axis is going to allow an additional motion. Then the uniaxial and the biaxial. And the shoulder is an example of a multi-axial joint. You're going to be able to go into all three axes here. So we're going to look at the shoulder, okay, because this is the best example of a multi-axial joint. So the humerus can move forward and backward around axis 1. This is like if you swing your arms back and forth when you're walking. So that's that first axis, backward and forward. The humerus can also move away from and toward your body, like when you're doing jumping jacks. All right. And then the third one is it can rotate in a circular fashion, like when you throw a frisbee. All right. So that would be around axis number 3. So that would be an example of a multi-axial joint. Okay. So hopefully with the concept boost, it really kind of helps you understand what we mean by uniaxial, biaxial, and multi-axial. Here's an example of the shoulder joint. Axis 1 would be swinging back and forth. Axis 2, moving them up and down. And then axis 3, of course, would be around all three of those, circular motion. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 general types of movements that can take place at a typical synovial joint. There are 4 movements. The first one is the gliding movement. Okay, gliding is simply a sliding motion between the articulating surfaces. It is non-axial. There's no axis that we're moving here. This is more common in your wrist. Okay, the carpal bones that make up your wrist, they're going to have that gliding motion when 2 bones basically slide on one another's surfaces. And I know that's kind of weird to think about, but again, there's a lot of cartilage and there's a joint capsule and a cavity there that's going to help ease that movement. The second one are angular movements. They either increase or decrease the angle between the 2 articulating bones. There are some very specific types of angular motion. The first one you probably heard of is called flexion. Flexion decreases the angle between the bones by bringing the bones closer to one another. Okay, everybody knows when you flex, and we'll show a picture in just a minute. Extension is when you increase the angle between the bones. So it's the opposite of flexion. The articulating bones move away from each other. Okay, and then hyperextension is when you extend beyond the anatomical position of the joint. So take a look at the pictures here. In picture A, we have our elbow. All right, so when we move our hand closer to our shoulder and flex our muscles, that's flexion. All right, when we return to anatomical position and straighten that arm out, that would be extension. Okay, now if we were to move the hand back further from anatomical position, that would be hyperextension. Okay, down here it shows hip flexion, extension, and hyperextension. So with your hip, if you were to bring your leg up, that would be flexion. Returning it back to anatomical position would be extension, and then moving it behind you would be hyperextension. Okay, same thing with the shoulder. Moving the hand forward would be flexion, returning it back to its original position would be extension, and then moving it behind you would be hyperextension. Okay, this also shows lateral flexion. Moving your head from side to side, you're decreasing the angle between your head and neck, so that would be lateral flexion. Same thing with your trunk. All right, if you were to lean over like this woman here is doing, this is also an example of lateral flexion. Okay, some more types of angular motion. Our second type is called abduction. We call it abduction. This is moving the body part away from the midline. All right, so I think AB, abduct. When you abduct something, you take it away. So you're moving the body part away from the midline. Adduction or adduction is moving it back towards the midline. So it's the opposite of abduction. And then you've got circumduction, which is the only unpaired angular movement. You have a freely movable distal bone that moves on a fixed proximal bone, kind of like a cone-shaped motion. It's a combination of flexion, extension, and AB and adduction. It almost makes like a circular motion. Like if you were to hold your shoulder still, but you were to move your arm in a circular motion, that would be circumduction. So we'll look at some examples. Right here, abduction. All right, abduction is when she moves her arms up. All right, like she was doing a jumping jack. Adduction would be when she brings them back down. Okay, you can abduct your fingers and toes. If you spread your fingers out or you spread your toes away from each other, that's abduction. All right, when you bring them back in together right here, this is going to be adduction. Okay, and then down here she is showing you circumduction, which again is that circular motion when you have a fixed proximal bone and then the distal bone is going to undergo that movement. All right, the third type of movement is rotation, and you probably already know what this is. It's non-angular. One bone rotates on an imaginary line that runs down a middle longitudinal axis. Okay, so when you move your head from right to left, that's going to be rotation. You can take your hip and rotate it internal rotation and external rotation. You can take your shoulder and do internal rotation and external rotation. Okay, so that's pretty self-explanatory. And the last one are just special movements. They are movements that are otherwise not defined by the previous category. So this is sort of like the catch-all group, miscellaneous. We have opposition and reposition. Opposition of the thumb at your first carpometacarpal joint allows the thumb to move across the palm surface of your hand. So if you were to take your thumb and kind of move it like you were putting up a number 4. And then reposition would be when you return it back to anatomical position. Depression and elevation. Depression is moving the body part in an inferior direction, while elevation is moving it in a superior direction. So like if you were to take your shoulders and like bring them up to your ears, like saying, I don't know, that would be elevation. And then returning them back to normal would be depression. So you can see the pictures of the opposition of the thumb A. Again, you see the thumb is bringing across the palm, kind of like holding up number 4. And then reposition is it going back to normal. Depression of the mandible, when you chew or talk, it goes down. Elevation, it comes back up. Protraction and retraction. Protraction moves the body part anterior, and retraction moves it posterior. Okay. We also have inversion and eversion. Inversion is a rotational motion where the plantar of the foot rotates toward the midline. Eversion is when it rotates the foot laterally away from the midline. So again, we'll look at some pictures. The mandible protraction is it goes anterior, which is to the front. Retraction is when it goes back, posterior. Inversion of the foot is when you bring the sole of your foot to the midline of the body, you invert it, and then eversion is when you take it laterally to the outside of the body. Okay, we have dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion is basically when the angle between the foot and leg decreases. Basically, you're flexing your foot. And then plantar is when you point your toes. All right, that's increasing the angle between the foot and leg. Okay, so those are pretty easy. Dorsiflexion, flex. Plantar flexion, you point your foot. So plantar, point your toes is how I remember that. Supination and pronation. These are rotational movements of the wrist. Whenever you supinate your forearm, your palm is facing forward. When you pronate, you rotate it so the palm is facing to the back. Okay? I had a student one time that came up with a great way to remember this. Supination. She presented her arms forward like supper is served. And then she rotated them back and said, probably not. I don't guess she cooked a lot at her house. Here they give you some kind of study boost, supination and pronation. You hold a cup of soup when your hand is supinated. So you hold the cup of soup for supination. You pour it out when your hand pronates. So that's also a really good way to remember that. Abduction, you take away from the body. Adduction, you add it back to the body. Okay? All right, we are going to stop there, and we will pick up with range of motion in the next video.